I am here to ask you to do something bold. Together, we are going to rescue Icarus. So as you probably remember, the legend of Icarus and his father Daedalus begins in the ancient Mediterranean Sea. Daedalus is supposedly the most capable craftsman among all the mortals, and he's hired by a king to create an inescapable labyrinth. The king ends up imprisoning Daedalus and his son Icarus in the maze. And to escape, Daedalus makes 2 sets of wings from feathers and wax. Before they take off, however, Daedalus reminds his son, stay low, stay focused. But as the legend goes, Icarus was overjoyed by the thrill of flight, and he went higher and higher and higher until he got so close to the sun, so close to the realm of the gods, that the wax melted, the wings disintegrated, and the boy fell to his death. So naturally then, we tend to point at Icarus as a fool, as an example of youth without discipline, and a warning to others to stay low, where it is safe, where it is familiar, and where it is comfortable. On the other hand, we honor Daedalus. So who has seen this statue right here? It's right over there in front of the Maxwell Club. It honors the National Order of the Daedalians, an organization of military flyers named after Daedalus. There's another monument to him. You may have seen it Randolph Air Force Base. These are just 2 of the ways that we honor Daedalus and what he stands for. He is rational, he is pragmatic, he's a technical expert. So we hold up Daedalus, and we'd rather forget the child. And we need to change that, and here's why. Rescuing the reputation of Icarus will help us encourage innovation. It will help you be better innovators, and it will help you appreciate our organizational heritage a little more. Now let me tell you how I would have reacted to that as a student at SOS. Innovation, okay, nothing to argue against there. Icarus, the dead guy, no, I'm not buying it. And our organizational heritage, I don't really care all about that very much either. So, since then, however, I've learned why that's wrong, why you need both Daedalus and Icarus to get radical innovation, and why airmen, why you have an inherent advantage in this innovation game. But first, we need to talk about what innovation is. That's just one of 5 short parts this morning that we'll talk about. So innovation. Innovation is not invention. Invention is a creative act. Someone creates something new. It might be an idea, it might be an object. When we develop that idea or object and we integrate it into what we do, that's when we have innovation. And we hear this word a lot. I mean, you can't spend a day here at SOS without hearing the word innovation over and over and over again. And not only do we hear about how crucial it is, we hear about how apparently we are really bad at it. So consider these actual headlines. And we're told that to be better at innovation, we just need to do things like be creative and be out of the box and build an innovation ecosystem, but don't forget that you need to fail fast, and not just fail fast, but you need to fail forward. And along the way, you need to learn to draw and orbit the hairball and brainstorm and steal like artists and take improv, work with others, work alone, and misspell works and thought that was the middle. It's all a little overwhelming. So well-meaning airmen have gone out into the private sector to figure out how they do this, how they innovate. And they've brought back a lot of the ideas and a lot of the buzzwords that I just mocked. But they've brought back another idea as well that's gotten a lot of attention both in the military and out. So who here has heard the term design? I imagine most of you have. But how would you define it? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? If I asked you for an example, would you tell me an architectural blueprint or a piece of fashionable clothing or a planning process? None of those ideas are wrong. It's just that design is just one of those words. It's too abstract, too messy, too slippery to submit itself to one all-encompassing definition. So let's talk about design in reference to a specific field, our own field, military art and science. Who here has heard the term operational design? It's part of what we used to call joint operation planning process. Now we just call it joint planning. Right? And just to be clear about something, you will learn this at SOS if you don't already know about it, and it's important to know, but that's not what I'm talking about today. So let's briefly talk about design in another context. Who here has heard the term design thinking? Okay, design thinking is a methodology where you take the techniques of artists and architects and these other professions that fall under the category of designer, and you try to apply those techniques to all sorts of problems. You try to get intentional innovation. It's often described in these ways where you need to empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. I actually, this last summer, had the opportunity to go visit the place that coined the term design thinking out in Silicon Valley, and then talk to engineers at Google X and also the president of Pixar about how they use it. And I am a big fan when it's used in the right context. And I'm not sure that for this audience, this is as useful for you as it was for, say, inventing the computer mouse, or developing a self-driving car, or crafting the next blockbuster animated movie. Now, I do want to be clear that we as humans care about innovation. I want you to be able to take either one of these processes and use it, assuming you've chosen the right one for the context. But I don't really care about the method as much as I care about the mindset. This idea of the mindset is where the myth comes back in. So let's use the two figures in the myth as metaphors for two sets of forces. And I know this is an oversimplification, but just play with it. I think the usefulness of the metaphor outweighs the deficiencies. So on the left, we have Daedalus. He represents the practical, the rational, the scientific. As a counterforce, we have Icarus on the right. He represents the playful, the romantic, and the artistic. We tend to be less comfortable with Icarus. I mean, I know I am, right? Did you know that Flex was originally called Icarus? Because they wanted to warn students of the dire consequences if you didn't take your job seriously. There was a famous study. Did you know this? There was a famous study by a think tank, RAND, that criticized Air Force officers for enjoying their job too much. And they called it the Icarus syndrome. Look, I've had the opportunity to study innovations in science, technology, leadership, and strategy for the last 7 years. And by the time I was done with my PhD, this was my key takeaway. You need both. I'm going to give you a few examples from my field, which is the history of technology. The Wright brothers, famous for their business minds and their attention to detail. But they were inspired by a toy helicopter their dad brought home when they were children. Gunpowder, first created for use in fireworks, for entertainment. The look of the first cell phone, inspired by a science fiction TV show, Star Trek. And the advanced radio communications we all use today, accelerated by amateur hobbyists just playing around. Now, if rescuing Icarus sounds strange, ludicrous, even unfamiliar, you need to know this about the myth. While some people explicitly honor his side of the spectrum, sometimes they explicitly honor Icarus himself. And that's weird, right? I mean, the dude dies, right? But what I've learned is that that's only one version of the myth. Sometimes he's depicted as having survived the fall. And even when the fall is still fatal, often the moral of the story is reversed. And Icarus is honored for his boldness, for his creativity, for his passion. So let me be clear, when I talk about rescuing Icarus, I don't mean we need to celebrate him at the expense of his father. I just mean we need to balance the relationship and honor both of them. We need to take a cue from the playbook of improv artists and say yes and instead of either or. We need to do this because innovation is the result of a mind that can hold both of these divergent forces in creative tension. A type of executive awareness that sits above both Daedalus and Icarus. A type of cognitive skill that probably sounds a lot more familiar to this audience than operational design or design thinking or Greek myth. I'm talking simply about a strategic mindset. So what is that? The strategic mindset. When I use strategic in this context, I don't mean long range, like strategic bombers of World War II. I don't mean a level of war as compared to the operational or the tactical level of war. I don't mean a planning level or a level of leadership, something like the people or the process of the National Defense Strategy. So what do I mean? I'm talking about strategic as a way of thinking that's often described as something involving critical analysis and creative synthesis, or a sensitivity to context, or ability to look at the whole big picture, or a proactive curiosity, a humility, a sense of imagination and empathy. But I think there's even a more familiar concept that describes what I'm talking about. I think a strategic mindset is essentially a playful mindset. Now, what do I mean by play? Because that is a word that's even harder to define than design. But as you came in here this morning, there was a slideshow playing, and it asked the question. It said, what do these pictures have in common? And the answer is play. Children play, musicians play, actors play, athletes play. We play games for fun. We play games to learn. You play games at SOS. You play Flex. You play TLP. You played the Marshmallow Challenge, where you learn that the teams that do the best are often those who play with their ideas earlier and more often. And all these things should remind us that play isn't about an absence of rules. It's about maximizing your advantage within a set of rules. We play in other ways as well. We play with ideas. We play to explore. We play to experiment. We play when it comes to what we do as defense professionals, right? We war game things, and often we play tricks on our enemies. In fact, think for a moment and step away from strategic as an adjective describing a way of thinking to strategy as a noun, as a theory of victory. It is often hard to tell the difference between a quote that is describing strategy or play. So we're going to play a game. I'm going to show you 6 quotes, one at a time, and I'm going to read it. And if you think the missing word is strategy, then I want you to stand. If you think the missing word is play, then stay in your seat. I'll reveal the answer, then everyone will sit down and we'll start over again. Here we go. Blank proceeds according to a set of artificial rules, and to the extent that it does, stands apart from ordinary or real life. You think that's strategy? Then stand. There you go. All right, sit back down. Here's the next quote. In a world of change, randomness, diversity, conflict, and ambiguity, this is perhaps the most appropriate response. If you think it's strategy, then stand. Play. Blank is about exploration and the development of new ways of seeing, thinking, and being. Who thinks this is about strategy? There you go. Blank is often about power, showdowns that make public the respective capabilities of the persons and groups involved. Is this play or strategy? Play. Blank is not about winning, but about embracing perpetual novelty. Strategy. This promotes survival when confronted with new or difficult circumstances. Is this play or is this strategy? Play. These are the quotes about strategy. These are the ones on play. In my opinion, they're pretty similar, which is how I even came across this in the first place. I was doing 2 different research projects, one on play, one on strategy, and I kept forgetting what was coming out of which document. Okay? But let's go back to the idea we started with, this idea of thinking and innovation. I talked about how there's a desire and a need for deliberate innovation, and how the idea of design has been used to meet that need both in the military and in the commercial world. And that this design requires a certain mindset. It's a mindset that can hold 2 sets of forces in creative tension. And those forces can be represented by Daedalus and Icarus. And that strategic thinking provides a balance between the pragmatic rationality of the father and the passionate creativity of the son. And lastly, that play can be many things, but in the form of thinking, when it describes a sense of thinking, it matches up well with the way experts describe strategic thinking. In other words, values of designers and strategists, empathy, imagination, social intelligence, and prototyping, they're all just forms of play. In fact, like the image of Icarus, many are quite explicit about the value of play, and not just for childhood development or for recreation, but for science and technology and strategy. So consider these quotes and consider who's saying them. Perhaps my favorite quote is this last one at the bottom by Albert Einstein. So all that to get to this part right here, the missing piece. The piece that is missing from our conversation about innovation. It starts with this, that innovation requires a type of play. That's only one half of the missing piece. Innovation requires a type of play that is inherent in Air Force culture. The playfulness of airmen is found in at least 3 ways that are honored in both the world of design thinking, whether the kind that comes out of Stanford or MIT, or the military design movement that you'll see in Special Operations Command. Obviously, play is not just these things. All those images that you saw in the beginning were examples, but here's 3 images that I think I can see in the Air Force culture and will help us with innovation. The first is storytelling. Storytelling is a type of cognitive play. And both strategists and designers will tell you that you need to be able to think in terms of narratives, in terms of stories. Scholars call storytelling the original virtual reality. And engaging in stories, studies have shown, increases your motivation, your empathy, your curiosity, your creativity, and your ability to make sense of complicated and complex situations. Air Force doctrine even tells us that Air Force officers should have the ability to tell the Air Force story. And early airmen were very good at telling stories. So I've read every single available English language diary and journal from World War I. And in the spaces between fighting, and there were lots of those, they did a lot of things that we would call play. They played sports, they played musical instruments, they played games, they gambled, they put on plays, and they engaged in the playful act of storytelling. They would tell tactical stories about what happened in their last sortie. They would tell technical stories about how to get the most out of their primitive aircraft. They would tell these wild, fanciful stories about how flying not only literally changed the way they saw the world, but how they thought about the world was changed by flight. And still today, Air Force units set aside time to tell stories. Flying squadrons have roll call. There are 2 NCOs at our Incirlik Air Base that created the Air Force Storytelling Program. It's kind of like a TED Talk. So how does this relate to innovation? Let me give you one example. Recently in Hawaii, they experienced a lot of emergencies or states where they needed to notify the airmen of a possible threat. And they discovered that their recall system was broken. So airmen came up with a new system. They came up with an app. But then they needed a way to sell this idea. They needed a way to get it out, to get people interested in using it. So they made a story. They made a video. I'm only going to show you 20 seconds of it.
For many, getting an assignment to Hawaii is a dream come true. But dreams can easily become nightmares.
Cell phone signals here were absolutely overloaded as people called their loved ones to say goodbye as others ran for cover. It was a chaotic and confusing scene and a place known for its tranquility.
So this is good storytelling, right? They set up the tension, they set up the problem, and then they resolve it by showing you the features and how to use their app. So let's go back to the airmen after World War I. They came home and they continued to tell stories. They told strategic stories about the character of modern warfare. They developed theories about how to use air power to avoid the bloody stalemate of World War I trench warfare. And if you think about air power, as well as space and cyber, the virtue of the domain is that you can go almost anywhere, anytime, but not everywhere all the time. And that implies the need to design a theory to guide the use of this powerful but precious asset. And that's why we say flexibility is the key to air power, because the nature of our effects precludes the type of direct persistence that you get with an overland campaign or a naval blockade. But what you get in return is a way to get to your end state faster, albeit in a more indirect manner. So let's talk about this indirect approach. After fighting in World War I, a famous theorist noted that in strategy, the longest way there is sometimes the quickest way to your goal. And what he's talking about is the difference between a cumulative approach and a sequential approach. And this is best described talking about the theaters of World War II. So in Europe, what does the army want to do? They want to march across the continent, get to Berlin, take the keys from Hitler, break his toys, and say, you can't play this game anymore. What do airmen want to do? They want to play with this new idea called the industrial web, where maybe if we hit multiple critical nodes, maybe the whole system will collapse, and we'll get to our goal with much less cost and blood and treasure. Take the Pacific. The Army, again, wants to follow a sequential approach, a sequence. Island A, Island B, Island C, all the way to the big island of Japan. And when you get to Z, you're done. You get to the Emperor, you take the keys, you break his toys, and say you can't play this game anymore. But what do airmen want to do? They want to try different things. They want to try A, X, and F, right? They want to accumulate an amount of effects to get the overall collapse that they are seeking. In Europe, this doesn't work. Really doesn't have time to work. In the Pacific, it does. Now, in the Pacific, we do have the advantage of some advanced technology. We've got the B-29, and we have the atomic bomb. In fact, fast forward to Desert Storm, and technology has finally caught up with airmen's ideas. We have the ability to hit these critical nodes at nearly the same time, right? This is not the destruction of the enemy armed forces. This is what one theorist described as, instead of going through the hands and feet to get to the heart, you just put a bullet in the brain. This is the idea behind Colonel Worden's 5-ring theory. So who has seen this before? This is the idea that you can create strategic paralysis by hitting critical points nearly simultaneously. And this may not seem like play, but it is. It's provoking the system, it's experimenting, it's prototyping, and it's quickly iterating and trying something else. By the way, he doesn't look too playful in that picture, so I called and asked if I could use that picture of him instead, and he said yes. So he'll be here in a couple weeks to talk to you about this. So how does this relate to innovation? Man on the left is General Everhart, commander of Air Mobility Command. The man on the right is Tech Sergeant Nathaniel Harris. What he is holding in his hands is essentially a bracket for an iPad. Aircrews use this when they fly in the C-17 and other aircraft as well. They created this to replace one that was inefficient. It broke all the time. So they replaced it. They manufactured this themselves at Travis Air Force Base. So why is this an indirect approach? Because when they heard that the MAGCOM commander was coming to their base, instead of going through the lengthy process of getting this whole thing approved, they just showed it to him. Said, what do you think? And the decision maker, he loved it. So who here flies with us now? Yeah. There's a third example of playfulness that I will call irreverence. This is something else that is evident in all the firsthand accounts of World War I, and a lot of people will say it is still present in our culture today. And they'll usually point to something superficial, like uniforms, or the fact that military discipline was never high on the priority list for military pilots, for Air Force pilots. They'll point to the motto of the Air Corps Tactical School, the origins of Air University. And their motto was that we make progress unhindered by custom. Or they'll point to this guy. But this idea of irreverence is deeper than mustaches or mottos. If innovation is about challenging the status quo, if it's about breaking the mold, if it's about shifting the paradigm, then you can't do that if you assume that the current system is sacred. You must consider that at least to some degree, the rules of the current game are themselves at play. And early airmen were certainly willing to play with new ideas. They were certainly willing to push back against the Army paradigm of warfare that was direct, sequential, sometimes inefficient, and often inhumane. Heck, they were even willing to move to Montgomery, Alabama, before air conditioning, just to get out from underneath the Army bosses who were dogmatic about the limited role that air power could play in warfare. There is one more clue that our organizational heritage honors the type of play that we now know is useful for innovation, the type of play exemplified by Icarus. It's that early airmen never shied away from using his name. Hap Arnold, the cultural founder of the Air Force, called him the test pilot of the service. Airmen wrote letters home about him. And even today, the Air Force Academy has a journal of creative writing named Icarus. But apart from that journal and a single statue at Wright Pat Air Force Base, we have largely forgotten the image of Icarus as a hero. And we need to change that. And here's why. Rarely do we talk about what happens next in the myth. Yes, Icarus dies. What happens to Daedalus, the father? He never invents anything ever again. He needs Icarus for inspiration, for perspective, for balance, and so do we. We need Icarus to remind us to play with bold ideas, to go over the maze instead of through it. We need Icarus to remind us to be excited about whatever it is that we do, whether it's flying, space, cyber, or force support. In all those fields, we need heroes who will innovate our culture from the inside out so that strategic thinking, playful thinking, is once again honored in our words as well as embodied more fully in our actions. Now, as critical thinkers, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, what exactly do you want me to do with this information? So there's two answers to that. One is the worksheet. You will work through that in your flight immediately after this briefing. It just takes the same ideas that I just talked about and runs you through a process kind of inspired by design thinking to hopefully generate some options for your insight paper. Here's the next thing I want you to do. I want you to take inspiration from the image of Icarus. I want you to go out and be bold and take risks. I want you to be playful in the ways that will make us better at the serious work of air power. Now, I admit, there are probably a wide variety of reactions to this. Some of you are probably skeptical. Skeptical that our organizational culture can do this. Skeptical that our organizational culture should do this. At least come tell me why. Some of you might be excited, just as excited as those early airmen who saw the potential for revolutionary change. A lot of you are probably just in the middle. Okay? Whatever it is, I want to keep the conversation going. I'll stay up here for the rest of the period to answer whatever questions you may have. You can find me in my office. You can find me online. And I'll post things online using the hashtag #RescueIcarus. And lastly, I'll say this. Thank you. Thank you for your time this morning. Thank you in advance for the feedback I hope you'll offer. And thank you for your service. Not only should we be proud of Icarus, but Icarus will be proud of you. Thank you.